Trump extended the ceasefire, and 4 hours later, Iran seized 2 ships. Let that sit for a second. Not days later, not in a different region, 4 hours in the same corridor, in the same stretch of water that the United States Navy has been patrolling with everything it has. And not only did the IRGC seize 2 commercial vessels, they opened fire on a third right there in the strait that moves roughly 20% of the world's oil supply every single day. This is Professor Zhang insight, where power shifts are decoded before anyone else dares to name them. Subscribe, hit the bell, and stay locked in, because what you are about to hear is not a story that mainstream coverage has fully put together yet. Now, here is the thing about that ceasefire extension. It was supposed to be a signal, a message from Washington to Thran that said, "We are giving you space. We are giving you time. Do not escalate." Diplomatic language, measured, controlled, the kind of gesture that is meant to lower temperature in a room that is already on fire. And the moment that signal went out, the moment the ink was metaphorically dry on that extension, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps was already moving in the strait, already intercepting, already closing in on commercial vessels that had no idea what was about to happen to them. And here is what that tells us. It does not tell us that Iran is reckless. It does not tell us that Tehran miscalculated. What it tells us is something far more disturbing. It tells us that someone inside the Iranian decision-making structure made a deliberate choice to act within the window of a ceasefire, not before it, not after it, inside it. That is not recklessness, that is a message. But that is not the real problem. The real problem is what was happening to the ships before they were seized. Because in the hours leading up to those intercepts, multiple commercial vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz experienced something that should not happen in one of the most monitored waterways on the planet. Their AIS signals, their automatic identification system transmissions, the digital heartbeat that tells the world exactly where a ship is, where it is going, how fast it is moving. Those signals went intermittent. Then they went dark. Ships were disappearing from the tracking systems that are supposed to protect them, and then they reappeared. But by the time some of them reappeared, the IRGC was already alongside them. This is where things get worse. AIS is not a secret technology. It is not classified. It is a mandatory international maritime standard. Every commercial vessel above a certain tonnage is legally required to broadcast its position. That signal is monitored by coastal authorities, by satellite systems, by naval command centers, by private shipping companies, by insurance underwriters, by port authorities around the world. It is the most fundamental layer of maritime situational awareness that exists. And inside the Strait of Hormuz, inside the kill zone, as some naval analysts have quietly started calling it, that layer is being compromised. Now, there are several ways this can happen: electronic jamming, GPS spoofing, localized signal suppression, or it can happen from within. A ship's crew can manually disable their AIS if they believe broadcasting their position creates more danger than it solves. But here is the critical point. Here's the thing that military analysts are already warning about in private channels and restricted communications. When multiple ships across a narrow corridor lose signal at overlapping times, in overlapping zones directly before a maritime intercept, that is not coincidence. That is a pattern. And patterns in intelligence analysis are not dismissed. Patterns are studied. And right now, what that pattern suggests is that the maritime tracking infrastructure in the Strait of Hormuz is being selectively degraded. Not everywhere, not all at once, but precisely, surgically in ways that create windows of operational invisibility. Windows that are apparently wide enough for an IRGC fast boat formation to move through undetected. Think about what that means for the U.S. blockade. Because the United States Navy did not deploy to the Persian Gulf region as a symbolic presence, the assets that have been positioned in and around the Hormuz corridor represent some of the most powerful force projection capability in the world. Carrier strike groups, guided missile destroyers, surveillance aircraft, undersea platforms, the full spectrum of American maritime dominance. And the political and military messaging from Washington has been consistent. The strait will remain open. Free navigation will be protected. Commercial shipping will not be held hostage to Iranian pressure. But here is the contradiction that no one in the briefing rooms is comfortable saying out loud. If the blockade is holding, if the American naval presence is functioning as a deterrent, then how did the IRGC seize 2 ships, not 1, 2, and fire on a third, in daylight in one of the most closely watched bodies of water on Earth? And that is where everything breaks down. Because a blockade is not simply about physical presence. A blockade is about information dominance. It is about knowing where every vessel is at every moment. It is about the ability to react faster than a threat can materialize. It requires perfect situational awareness. And if the situational awareness layer, the AIS layer, the satellite coverage, the real-time tracking is being degraded inside the corridor, then the blockade is not operating with perfect information. It is operating with gaps. And in those gaps, things happen that were not supposed to happen. The reality is this: the United States has extraordinary capability in that region. No one serious disputes that. But extraordinary capability is not the same as omniscience. And the IRGC has spent decades, literally decades, studying exactly how to operate in the margins of American capability. They know where the sensors are. They know the patrol rhythms. They know the communication handoff points. They have mapped with painstaking detail the seams and the gaps in U.S. naval coverage. And what happened in the hours following that ceasefire extension suggests that someone in Thrawn pressed a button on a playbook that has been sitting in a drawer, updated and refined for a very long time. Military analysts are already warning that this is not an improvised response. This is a demonstration. Let us talk about what the IRGC actually is for a moment, because this matters enormously for understanding what just happened. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is not the Iranian military in the conventional sense. It is not a defense force. It is a revolutionary force. It has its own intelligence apparatus, its own naval wing, its own aerospace division, its own economy, controlling billions of dollars in commercial enterprises, construction contracts, import networks, and yes, smuggling operations. It answers not to the Iranian president, not to the foreign minister, not to any of the conventional diplomatic structures. It answers to the supreme leader, and its mandate is not to defend Iran. Its mandate is to defend the revolution. Those are not the same thing. And that distinction matters enormously when you are trying to understand why an organization would seize ships inside a ceasefire window in direct view of American naval assets. Because for the IRGC, this is not a tactical error. This is a theological and ideological statement. But there is something deeper here, something that the coverage of the ship seizures tends to gloss over, and it connects directly to the AIS blackouts. Because here is the question that intelligence analysts are now asking. Who benefits from ships going dark in the Strait? The obvious answer is Iran, specifically the IRGC naval wing, which uses those windows of invisibility to close on targets before any intervention can be organized. But the deeper answer, the answer that makes this situation genuinely dangerous, is that Iran is not the only actor that has developed the capability to suppress or degrade tracking signals in that corridor. There are other players, regional actors, non-state networks, and there is a very real possibility, not confirmed but not dismissed, that the AIS degradation is not exclusively an IRGC operation, that it may involve coordination with, or at minimum exploitation of other technical actors who have their own reasons to want maritime visibility in the Strait to be compromised. Intelligence reports suggest that the electronic warfare environment in the northern Persian Gulf has grown significantly more complex over the past 18 months. Multiple signal interference signatures have been recorded that do not match known Iranian electronic warfare systems, which means someone else is operating in that space. Someone who wants the same thing the IRGC wants. Ships that cannot be seen, ships that cannot be tracked, ships that can be made to disappear. And that is where the word dangerous stops feeling like a description and starts feeling like an understatement. Now let us talk about the ceasefire itself, because the extension that Trump announced is not a minor diplomatic footnote. It is a significant piece of the architecture of whatever the United States has been attempting to construct in its pressure campaign against Thrawn. The logic of the ceasefire, or at least the logic as it was intended to be understood, was this: we are giving diplomatic space. We are signaling that military options are not the first tool on the table, and we are expecting reciprocal restraint. That is how ceasefires function. That is the basic contract. But the IRGC does not honor contracts it did not sign. And the IRGC was not at the table when the extension was announced. The Iranian Foreign Ministry was. The Iranian President's office was. The Supreme Leader's office issued its own carefully worded statement. But the IRGC, the organization that controls the fast boat formations, that controls the naval interdiction units operating in the Strait, the IRGC issued nothing, said nothing publicly, and then moved anyway. And this is where things get genuinely complicated from a strategic standpoint, because now Washington is faced with a question that has no clean answer. The ceasefire was extended as a gesture of restraint, and that gesture was met within 4 hours with a double ship seizure. So what does the next move look like? The options are narrow, and every single one of them carries consequences that compound the problem, rather than resolving it. Option 1. The United States escalates its naval posture, moves additional assets into the Strait, and signals a zero-tolerance posture for future IRGC intercepts. The problem with this option is that additional assets in a degraded tracking environment are not necessarily more effective assets. If the AIS layer is being compromised, if the electronic warfare environment is being actively manipulated, then more ships in the corridor simply means more ships operating with imperfect information. It also risks a miscalculation. An IRGC fast boat that cannot be tracked until it is 200 meters away from a destroyer is not a threat that additional destroyers necessarily solve. Option 2, diplomatic back-channel pressure. A quiet message through intermediaries that the seizures were a ceasefire violation, that consequences will follow, that Throne needs to rein in the IRGC. The problem with this option is the fundamental structural reality we have already discussed. The IRGC does not report to the people receiving the diplomatic messages. Telling the Iranian Foreign Ministry to control the IRGC is like telling a city mayor to control a military organization that answers to a completely separate chain of command. It may produce words. It will not necessarily produce behavior change. Option 3, a targeted response not against Iranian territory, but against IRGC naval assets in the Strait, patrol boats, forward operating positions, command structures. A signal that says, you seize ships, we destroy the ships that seize them. The problem with this option is escalation arithmetic. The IRGC is structured precisely to absorb this kind of response and use it as justification for the next level of action. And the next level of action in a corridor that moves 20% of global oil would trigger an energy market disruption that the global economy, already fragile, already stressed, cannot absorb without serious damage. Option 4, negotiation over the seized ships, quiet concessions release secured through diplomatic trade. The problem with this option is what it signals to every other actor watching. If you seize ships during a ceasefire and receive a negotiated release rather than a military consequence, you have established a template, and templates get replicated not just by Iran, by every regional actor that is watching this moment and taking notes. Option 5, maintain the current posture. Absorb the incident as a one-time event. Preserve the ceasefire architecture, and bet that the political cost of escalation outweighs the strategic cost of restraint. The problem with this option is the AIS blackouts, because if the tracking degradation is systematic, if it is being operationally refined with each use, then the next incident will not be 2 ships. It will be more. It will be worse. And the window of American response capability will be narrower. The truth is there is no clean option on this table. Every path forward carries a cost that compounds the problem in a different direction. And that is exactly how the IRGC designed it. Defense experts understand something that is worth stating plainly here. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a waterway. It is the most strategically significant choke point on Earth in terms of energy flow. 20% of global oil supply, 30% of global liquefied natural gas. A corridor that is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, 21 miles, less than the distance between some cities. And through that 21-mile gap flows enough energy to power entire economies. Shut it down for 2 weeks. Fully shut it down. Not partially, not with detours and workarounds, but actually close it. And you do not just cause a price spike, you cause cascades. Industrial production freezes in energy-dependent economies. Transportation networks seize up. Agricultural supply chains fail because the fertilizers and fuels that move food require oil that cannot be priced or delivered. The human cost of a prolonged Hormuz closure is not measured in dollars. It is measured in systems that stop working. And that is what makes this moment so dangerous, because the IRGC knows all of that. Every operational commander in that organization has studied exactly what the Strait means and exactly what controlled disruption of it achieves. They do not need to close it. They do not even need to threaten to close it in an explicit way. All they need to do is make it feel uncertain. Make it feel like the next ship that enters might disappear. Make the insurance underwriters nervous. Make the shipping companies root. Make the freight rates spike. Make the energy traders hedge. Make the markets move. Because if the markets move, if the cost of oil climbs, if the global economic anxiety ratchets up, Thran has achieved leverage without firing a single missile at a military target. And that is precisely what just happened. The ships were not seized because the IRGC wanted those ships. They were seized to send a message about what the strait costs to use when Iran decides it costs something. 2 commercial vessels, their crews, their cargo. They are not the point. They are the instrument. The point is the message. And the message was received the moment freight rates began adjusting and shipping companies began reviewing their Hormuz transit decisions. Now let us bring this back to the tracking blackouts, because this is where the architecture of what is happening becomes visible in a way that is genuinely alarming. Intelligence reports suggest that the AIS degradation in the strait is not random. It is not technical malfunction. The pattern of blackouts, the timing, the geography, the correlation with intercept events suggests active management. Someone or some combination of actors is managing the visibility environment inside the corridor, creating zones where ships cannot be seen, creating windows where fast boats can move without being tracked until they are already in contact range. And here is the implication that defense analysts are wrestling with. If you can manage the visibility environment in a 21-men choke point, if you can selectively blind the most sophisticated naval surveillance architecture in the world for windows of time measured in minutes, then you have effectively created a new kind of maritime warfare. Not kinetic in the traditional sense, not missile strikes or torpedo runs or surface engagements, but a form of warfare that exploits the informationational layer, the data layer, the invisible infrastructure of situational awareness that modern naval operations depend on. Absolutely. Military analysts are already warning that this represents a qualitative shift in what the IRGC can achieve inside the strait, not because their physical assets have improved dramatically, but because their information warfare capability, their ability to degrade the information environment that their adversaries depend on, has reached a level where physical capability differences matter less than they used to. Think about what that means for the blockade. The blockade works if you can see everything. The blockade becomes a different calculation entirely if you can only see most things. And the IRGC just demonstrated in front of the entire world that they can create conditions where you cannot see everything. What this means is that the conversation about the strait has to shift, because the conversation that has been happening, the conversation about carrier strike groups and naval assets and force projection and deterrence, that conversation assumes formational dominance. It assumes that the surveillance layer functions, and right now that assumption is under challenge in a way that no press release from U.S. Central Command is going to resolve quickly. The reality is that fixing the AIS vulnerability, hardening the maritime tracking infrastructure, closing the electronic warfare seams in the corridor, is not a matter of issuing orders or deploying assets. It is a technical and operational problem of significant complexity. Satellite-based AIS backup systems exist, but they can be degraded. GPS backup positioning systems exist, but they can be spoofed. The redundancy in maritime tracking was designed for technical failure, not adversarial exploitation at the level being observed in the strait right now. And while those systems are being evaluated, while the technical response is being assembled and tested and deployed, the IRGC is operating and the ships are transiting, and the ceasefire is technically still in place, and the next window of AIS blackout may already be scheduled. Now here is the global dimension, because this does not stay local. Nothing in the Hormuz corridor stays local. The moment you affect the pricing and availability of 20% of global oil supply, you have touched every economy that imports energy, which is most of them. And right now you have a set of major economies, Europe, Japan, South Korea, India, that are watching the Strait of Hormuz with the particular anxiety of nations that cannot absorb an extended energy disruption. Their industrial recovery is fragile. Their energy import budgets are already strained, and their ability to reroute supply chains around a Hormuz disruption is limited by geography, by infrastructure, and by the simple fact that there is no alternative corridor that handles the volume. China is watching this with a different kind of attention. Beijing imports roughly 40% of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz, 40%, which means any sustained disruption in that corridor is not a peripheral inconvenience for China. It is a core strategic threat. And China's response to that threat is not to align with Washington's deterrence posture. China's response is to maintain its own separate channel of communication with Thrawn to avoid being drawn into a confrontation framework that puts its energy supply at risk, and to quietly pressure both sides to avoid the kind of escalation that closes the corridor entirely. But here is the tension in that position. China's pressure on Iran to avoid full closure is not the same as Chinese support for American deterrence operations. And the IRGC is sophisticated enough to understand the difference. They understand that as long as they stay below the threshold of full closure, as long as they seize ships and fire warning shots and degrade tracking systems without actually stopping the flow entirely, they retain a zone of operation that multiple great powers have contradictory incentives to respond to. Russia is watching too, and Russia's interest in a complicated, tense Hormuz corridor is not hidden. Elevated oil prices, even temporary, even partial, benefit Russian energy export revenues. Distraction and resource commitment from the United States in the Persian Gulf region reduces American capacity to focus on other theaters. A ceasefire that looks shaky, a blockade that looks less than airtight, a global narrative of American deterrence under question. All of that plays into a geopolitical environment that Russia finds strategically advantageous, not because Russia orchestrated any of this, but because the opportunistic dimension of great power competition means that what is bad for one actor's credibility is often passively good for another actor's position. And this is the world we are operating in. Multiple great powers with contradictory interests, a choke point that is simultaneously essential and increasingly contested. An adversary that has spent decades refining the ability to operate in the margins of superior power. A tracking infrastructure that is being actively degraded, and a ceasefire that lasted exactly 4 hours before the first ships were seized. The question that keeps surfacing in restricted analytical circles, and it is not a comfortable question, is, this is the ceasefire itself, a tool, not in the diplomatic sense that it was intended, but as a tactical instrument, as a cover, a condition under which the IRGC can operate with slightly more latitude, because the political context of a ceasefire makes kinetic American response more complicated to authorize, more politically expensive to execute. If you seize ships during an active military confrontation, you have escalated. But if you seize ships during a ceasefire, during a period of diplomatic restraint and supposed de-escalation, you have created a political problem for your adversary before you have created a military one. Because now the question is not just what do you do about the ships,